was calling to report a missing person.
while asking the court for mercy.
Paranoia that came out of me was incredible.
Discover what they believe to be human remains.
The following stories tell the tale of truly disturbed parents. Once, they cared for their children. Now, they tried to take their lives. Today's first story begins in Augusta, Georgia. LaTanya Janelle Carewell was born on April 17, 2001. She was raised by her mother, Tanya, who seemed to protect and care for her daughter, up to a point. In 2015, Tanya married Leon Tripp, who was in prison at the time. They had met while he was in prison and corresponded regularly until their marriage. As soon as he went out, Leon moved straight into Tanya and Janelle's home. Leon had a strange influence over Tanya, but Janelle wasn't aware of this until much too late. Janelle was a bright girl who was focused on her studying. In 2017, she was an honor student at T.W. Josie Comprehensive High School. She had nothing but high grades, and her family friends described her as a very kind and intelligent girl.
Janelle was a loving, very intelligent, smart young woman who wanted to be a doctor, who was an honor student.
On April 17th, 2017, Janelle celebrated Easter as well as her birthday with her family. It was Easter Sunday, so they stayed at home and had a cookout. Everything seemed normal, and Janelle seemed happy.
She had not reporting any problems to anyone. The neighbors saw nothing. They were having a cookout. She was inviting friends over. So it was nothing for us to suspect that there was something going on.
That night, Tanya went to bed early, and Janelle stayed behind with Leon to clear up the party. Janelle eventually went to bed, but Leon woke her up at around midnight. He wanted to borrow Janelle's phone. Leon wanted to help his friend, whose car had broken down, with a ride. Leon said he wanted to use Janelle's phone for directions, but his lack of knowledge of technology meant she had to come with him to Clarksville, South Carolina.
What stepdad wanted his daughter to go with him to help another guy at 1 o'clock in the morning?
Janelle had no choice but to help her stepdad. But the next day, the emergency services in Augusta got a phone call.
Yes, ma'am. I was calling to report a missing person.
Give me 1 second.
I pray to God that they not, but it's not like them not to answer the phone.
Tanya told the police both Leon and her daughter were missing and seemed deeply distraught at the thought of losing both of them.
I've been calling and texting.
You're not answering?
Neither one. And that's not like neither one of them, because they see me calling, they gonna answer.
Tanya told the police that Leon had taken her cell phone as he didn't have map services on his. But Leon had taken Janelle with him exactly for her smartphone. However, the police didn't know this. They started a thorough search throughout Georgia, South Carolina, and all the neighboring states. Meanwhile, Tanya was pleading on TV for people to bring Janelle home.
I'm not eating, I'm not sleeping, I'm just worried about my family.
Indeed, that's what it looked like at the time. What mother wouldn't be in shambles at the thought of losing her daughter? And the story seemed to get even sadder. Tanya said she couldn't join Leon on the trip to South Carolina because she had cancer.
I do have cancer. I have brain cancer and I have lung cancer.
But the police were about to uncover one of the darkest criminal stories of our time. In late April, the police discovered Leon's abandoned truck just a few miles away from their home. Inside the truck were no signs of struggle. The police then looked at Leon and Janelle's cell phones.
Based on those tower readings, none of it suggested that they were in the Clark Hill area as he originally had stated.
And it soon got creepier. While Janelle was nowhere to be found and her social media accounts were dead, someone spotted Leon in Atlanta, over 100 miles from Augusta. Apparently, Leon had friends and even a girlfriend there. He made several trips between Atlanta and Augusta in May, where the police were looking for him. While Leon kept evading them, the police looked into his history. It wasn't good.
Leon Tripp was in prison. He had some assault charges. He had some cruelty to children charges.
Now Leon was an official suspect for the kidnapping of Janelle. When reporters asked Tanya how she felt about this, she became extremely defensive of her husband.
She even went on the media speaking out against the sheriff's office, saying that we were wrong and we were falsely accusing her husband.
Finally, a call came in. Leon was sighted at a U-Haul depot in Atlanta. But when the police arrived at the scene, Tanya was right there with him. They were both arrested, and Tanya was charged with the hindering and apprehension of a criminal.
And that's when we really got that sick feeling that, this case is really not heading in a good direction.
Tanya literally said that she ran into Leon in Atlanta, but the police knew that there was more to uncover. As the police interviewed Leon and Tanya, their stories started drifting apart. Tanya said Leon and Janelle drove to Clarksville, and she hadn't heard from them since. Leon said he actually drove Janelle to Atlanta, gave her money to get on a bus, and that's the last time he saw her. But when the police confronted Tanya with Leon's story, she suddenly became tongue-tied. A bit more research proved that Tanya wasn't suffering from cancer either. She was a pathological liar, and she was complicit in the disappearance of Janelle. The police were now looking at a homicide. Tragically, on March 8th, 2018, they would be proved right.
We received a phone call from a citizen and had discovered what they believed to be human remains.
This was the body of Janelle Carwell, killed and buried by Leon Tripp. It turns out Tanya and Leon had tried to hire someone to kill Janelle 3 times before Leon went through with their horrific plan. The reason for this is still unknown. Both Leon and Tanya were charged with Janelle's murder. Tanya faces second-degree murder charges, and Leon faces the death penalty. This story takes us to sunny South Africa, the home of Nomia, Rosemary, and Lovo, who worked as a police officer in the big city of Johannesburg. Johannesburg is a bustling city that never sleeps, but it also has a history of severe economic divide. There's a 37% unemployment rate, and 29% of the population lives in poverty. Rosemary was born in 1975 and grew up with her mother, Maria, and her dad and her sisters. Her friends and family describe her as brash and masculine. Rosemary seemed to make the best out of these traits, choosing a career in law enforcement after graduating from high school. In 2011, Rosemary started a relationship with Maurice Mabasa, who worked for the U.S. Embassy. Maurice juggled a lot of work with caring for his family of 13 siblings, which he tried to provide for. Financial struggle was a reality for both Maurice and Rosemary, and sometimes this would lead to fights between the two. However, Maurice struggled financially because he shared his earnings with his large family. Rosemary, on the other hand, was well paid, but chose to spend most of her money on gambling, which she had a long-term addiction with. Rosemary would encourage her poorer relatives to get life insurance. Unfortunately, the mortality rate in South Africa's poor neighborhoods is tragically high, so this piece of advice didn't sound wrong for Rosemary's family. In 2012, Rosemary insured life insurance for her cousin, Witness Madala Homu. She listed herself as Witness's wife. In March that year, Witness disappeared. Unfortunately, as he had lived in poverty, he had no phone or social media account, and no picture that his family could show to the media. While her family was distraught and deeply worried, Rosemary assured them that she would do all in her power to find Witness. What no one in her family knew, though, was that Rosemary had hired someone to kill Witness, and this was only the first victim in a long list of relatives Rosemary would kill for their life insurance. Witness's body was soon found by the police a few towns north of Johannesburg. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, so the police quickly opened a homicide case. Sadly, the case was not considered worth the funds or the time for the Johannesburg police. Crime in the lower class neighborhoods has been normalized for quite some time, and the police wanted to catch bigger fish. When witness was laid to rest, Rosemary, who had just taken his life insurance, contributed almost nothing to his funeral. In June 2013, Rosemary invited her sister, Audrey, to dinner. This was unlike Rosemary, but Audrey was happy to share an evening with her sister. But Rosemary wanted to visit Audrey, not the other way around. That night, she poisoned and strangled her sister with her bare hands. The next morning, Rosemary reported her sister missing to the police. When they went to Audrey's home together, Rosemary screamed and cried, apparently shocked by her sister's tragic death. Following Audrey's murder, Rosemary took 700,000 rand, or $45,000, from her life insurance. Audrey could hardly afford the room she lived in. In 2014, Rosemary took a new job as a constable at a new police station. Her colleagues described her behavior as switching between kind, generous, paying for everyone's lunch, and dark, gloomy, and complaining about being broke. Rosemary spent all her blood money on gambling. But in 2014, Rosemary became pregnant and gave birth to her first daughter, Makanani. But Rosemary and Maurice's relationship only got worse. Throughout the following year, Maurice kept leaving and coming back home. But in October of 2015, all of that came to a halt. The next day, after Rosemary reported him missing, the police found his body in the same town that they found witnesses. He had been stabbed over 80 times. In June 2016, Rosemary's niece, Janelle, came to stay at her place for a few days. Shortly, she was ran over by a car. She was taken to the hospital, then was quickly discharged, as she had only had minor injuries. But the next day, Rosemary took her back to the hospital. Janelle was crying from very intense chest pain. Within minutes, she was dead. Janelle had several broken ribs and a poisoned liver. Rosemary said she had no idea how this happened and tried to blame it on the car accident, but the doctors remained suspicious. Rosemary then targeted Janelle's two brothers, her own nephews. In April 2017, she offered to drive her nephew, Mayani, to Pretoria. Soon enough, the same hired hitman killed Mayani. But this time, the insurance company wanted proof that Rosemary was Mayani's partner. And since she couldn't produce any, she didn't get the money. Later that year, Rosemary's last victim, Brilliant, was found dead. The police tracked Rosemary as the last person to see Brilliant, but she denied any claims and refused to speak to the authorities. In 2018, Rosemary approached another paid assassin to kill her sister and her 6 children. Luckily, the assassin snapped and called the police. Rosemary was arrested and faced an incredibly long trial, as the prosecution would uncover gruesome murder by gruesome murder. All the while, Rosemary denied everything. Finally, after being given 6 life sentences in prison, Rosemary shed a tear.
The former cop turned killer shed a tear herself while asking the court for mercy.
As Rosemary will spend her life behind bars, her sister Joyce will have to live with the trauma of knowing that her sister tried to burn her and her children alive. This last story takes us to Wellington, Florida. Wellington was home to a seemingly happy family: Neil Jacobson, his wife Frankie, and their twin sons, Eric and Joshua. Not only did they have a peaceful family life, they were also millionaires. But something wasn't right with Neil. He had suffered from depression for quite some time, and in January 2010, Frankie decided it was time for a change. Right after New Year's, Neil was complaining about backache and fatigue. so Frankie took him to the doctor. Neil was prescribed antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicine, including Zoloft and Xanax. On January 23, 2010, Neil woke up and decided to kill his entire family. This was the twins' 7th birthday.
When I woke up early in the morning, and I remember I'm in my closet, and I'm kind of sitting on the floor and hearing voices. You've got to go. Now's the time. You have to go. These voices just getting louder and louder and more intense.
Neil went into the closet and reached for his revolver, which was standing next to a 5-page letter Neil had written 3 days before. Frankie, who was still sleeping in their bed, asked Neil what he was doing in the closet that early in the morning. This was the last conversation Neil had with his wife before shooting her in the face twice. Then, Neil reloaded his gun and headed towards his son's bedrooms. They were still sleeping, getting a rest before a fun birthday party with laser tag and go-karting. But none of that was going to happen. Neil walked into Eric's room and shot him twice in the face, spraying blood to the ceiling. Eric gurgled, but was still alive.
After I had done what I did to Eric, I heard a noise from him, like gurgling. And I thought to myself at that point, I can't just leave him like that. And there's something going with that.
So, Neil put a pillow over his face and shot him twice more. Then, Neil reloaded once more and headed to Joshua's room. He put a pillow on his face and shot him in the face twice. Then, Neil headed to the bathroom, washed his family's blood off his hands, and then went back to the boys' rooms. He started shaking their bodies. Then Neil had one last thing to do. He swallowed an enormous amount of Vicodin, Zoloft, and Xanax tablets. He wanted to go with the rest of his family. But he wasn't in luck. The neighbors already alerted the police about the gunshots, and Neil was arrested and saved from certain death. Neil is serving 3 life sentences for killing his family. There is no possibility for parole. For a decade, he didn't speak about what had happened. In fact, he barely spoke at all. But in 2022, Neil finally spoke about the horrific event. He describes the effects of the antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication as paranoia and hallucination-inducing.
The paranoia that came out in me was incredible. That I hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night for about 2.5 weeks straight when I got that medication. That medication did something to me. The Zoloft, it felt like my brain was literally on fire. It felt like it was so hot.
Neil Jacobson is not the first person to blame a murderous rampage on psychotropic medications. But in his case, friends, family members, and even his doctors say they cannot shake the notion that the commonly prescribed antidepressants and benzodiazepines he was taking might be at least partially responsible. Indeed, the symptoms Neil describes match thousands of other reports about the same medication. What makes this story even more tragic is that there can be no closure for anyone in the family. There can be no justice brought for Frankie, Eric, and Joshua. And the confusion around the lack of motive adds to the sadness of it all.
I don't know. I don't know what can make someone do something like this. I don't know. I wish I did know. If I did know, I would do everything in my power to save her.
Even Neil doesn't understand why he did what he did that day. This is what he said about his family. They never did anything in my life other than to make me love them. And people have a hard time and say, how can he do that if he loved them? But the person that did that to them is not me. Neil will never be able to deal with his actions, and that is his biggest punishment.
It's crushing to me every day. I literally cry every day. There's not a day it doesn't cry. That I don't cry.
It's a tragic and horrifying story that can perhaps work as an incentive for better medical care. Many of the antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications that are regularly prescribed in the US have been banned in other parts of the world. What do you think about these cases? Let me know in the comments, and while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, stay safe out there.